Doors. You've probably heard of doors before. They're just like a piece of metal or wood that has a couple hinges on them and a doorknob usually that allows you to open them or close them. They're kind of like a wall that you can move around. Not very complicated. You've heard of them, you've used them, you probably don't even notice them most of the time. But what if I told you that for video game developers, they are very complicated problems and features that many of the times aren't even included in games? For example, the Assassin's Creed series, the entire franchise, to my understanding, doesn't have doors in it at all. The designers at Ubisoft just decided that they weren't worth the hassle of implementing. And the latest Cold War or Black Ops game didn't have them in the beginning of the game. They just prove a difficulty for developers. Why is that? Well, basically, doors add a flexibility to the game that requires all other aspects of the features and the mechanics and the systems to interact with. Think of a door as a part of the static environment in which the characters and the NPCs and AIs are interacting, but it's not a static part of that static environment. It moves, it has different states, and you have to answer questions about them. For instance, is the door only in two states, open or closed? Can it also be locked? Can it be slightly open? What about sound effects? The different sound effects for when the doors are open and closed. And all doors are different, so they're going to have different sound effects and different ways the players interact. It's not just the players, but AIs and NPCs also have to interact with all of the doors in your game. And you have to ask yourself all of these different questions, including things like, can this specific door be opened? Is this simply just aesthetic and the player's not supposed to go through? How does the player distinguish between a door they can interact with and a door they can't? And a big question, which is one I wanted to be able to address in my game, is how to make doors an important part of the game while also feeling so passive and in the background that you barely notice they're there most of the time. In the real world, I open and close that door without thinking about it. In a video game, they can be a hassle and a problem if not implemented properly. AAA studios will often try to avoid the problem entirely by not implementing doors into their game at all. But for me, I really wanted to concentrate on immersion and realism for this game, and so having doors in my game was an absolute necessity. This entire sprint was just dedicated to implementing doors, and I'd say I'm gotten maybe 50% to 75% done with the core mechanic. That doesn't even include animations of the character interacting or how AIs are going to interact or what a locked door means. So, without further ado, let's dive in to the doors that I implemented during this sprint. Alright, here we are at the Trello board, and immediately I want to point out that I did not cover everything I was intending to this sprint. Starting out, I knew that doors were going to be a hassle and a difficult thing to implement, but I really didn't think it was going to take me 2 whole weeks to get to where I am at. However, that was the case, and so updating the inventory system, updating the conversation pane artwork, and creating those base character sprites that I worked on a few weeks back just had to wait. They're going to be pushed back to the backlog or more likely be pulled into the next sprint. All I did this time was I updated the feature document outlining why I needed doors, much to what I've been talking about at the beginning of this segment, and then implementing doors themselves. So let's just go ahead and hop into Unity and look at what we have. So, as you can see, not much has changed, but there's a door sitting over there. So if I go ahead and hit play, I'll show you what I have. So, first of all, before I show you exactly what this is, the first day of this sprint, I sort of went on a walk and tried to outline exactly what I needed for the doors in my game. And as I said at the beginning, they need to be something the players aren't noticing. It needs to be so fluid that it's just a normal thing. And also, similar to my seamless scene transitions where I don't want any loading screens, the door itself can't be a loading screen where the player is entered into an animation that they're locked into and can't choose to back out. If they're going into the tavern and realize that they actually have to go to the market instead, I don't want them frantically hitting B to get out of that motion, and as their character just walks through the door, then they have to walk back through again. It may seem simple, but a good rule of thumb I've decided is if there's any animation, like climbing through a window, climbing over a wall, going through a door, that the player can't at any moment break out of, that's basically a cutscene. A time where the player is just watching their character do something for however short. And something you have to ask when you're making a game is, Do you want cutscenes in your game? Is it a game that's supposed to have cutscenes? And should there be a cutscene for little movements like this? In my case, no. I want the player to feel like they have full autonomy at every moment in the game. I don't want them to feel like they're watching a character do something like go through a door. I want them to feel like they are the character. So one important thing that I wanted was I wanted the player to have full autonomy through the action, which is what made this very difficult. And then the other thing, as I mentioned, it needs to be something that's happening in the background. That'll be something that will require fine-tuning as we go ahead, but I think I've made a good start. All right, so with all that preface, let me walk over to the door and interact. You might have noticed my player did that little animation of reaching up to the door, and you can see I can walk through this door, and as I go through, it closes behind me. If I come up from above, my character opens the door, and I can walk through the door, and it closes behind me again. So, pretty simple movement. Nothing, it looks nice, but again, so remember, this is not 3D, so I'm having to draw these different sprites to implement it. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about what's really going on. So you'll notice that the player does have autonomy as they're going through the door. Really, the only thing they can't do is decide to go through the door immediately. There's that moment when they're pushing into the door that they can't go through, but at any moment they can walk out of that. So yes, it's slowing them down, but it's not slowing them down a whole lot, and there's no moment throughout this activity where they can't decide, no, I don't want to go through this door, let me walk away. They can also decide to stay in the door. And maybe this will feed into mechanics where they can peek through a door and listen to a conversation. I don't know. Ultimately, the point is they can just stand there if they want to. That's what I was running into as I was going through this. I was like, there's so many things they can do. Like, they can stand here, they can walk through, they can go slowly, they can turn around, they can back up. At first, I was just addressing the fact that they can back up, and then I realized, no, what happens if they just stand in the door? This led me from using the animation abilities within Unity, such as this animation pane down here, where the animation steps through frame by frame. I had to completely throw that away and implement my own animation system that lets it just sort of sit at one frame or another, because most animation systems aren't designed to just stop in the middle of frames. It's supposed to go at a consistent rate, like the character's walking. All right, let's jump into the code a little bit just to explain exactly what's going on here, because that was the bulk of the work. I'm not going to go into great depth. I know not all of you are coders, and you don't need to be copying and pasting my code, but hopefully this will give you a good understanding of what's going on. So first of all, if we look at this player movement script, a lot of it's similar to what we've seen before. This fixed update with the animations here and the movement, which is basically just setting it to move in this direction along the X and Y based on which arrow keys you're pressing. We've seen it before, but I've added more. This script just keeps getting more complicated and more complicated as we implement new features in the game and systems in the game that manipulate how the player moves. We now have these two right here. When the player enters into collision with another object, which is a whole topic on itself, and when the player exits contact with an object. And all we're doing is we're checking the tag. If the tag is door, which I've set up to be for those doors, it's basically looking at the name of the object and seeing if it's door. Then we set these variables, set animations and stuff. Otherwise, we undo those sets. So this isn't super important right here. This is just important for the other script, this door script, to be able to know when it's supposed to be interacting with the player and when it's not supposed to be. Over here is where all of the magic is really happening. On start, we don't need to worry about on start right now, but within fixed update, and I decided to put it in fixed update instead of just update for reasons, don't worry about it, it's not important. Basically what's happening here is it's checking if this variable is opening from below is true. So in a previous script, I've had to determine another thing, is the player walking in from the top? Are they walking in from the bottom? I have to know specifically that because I'm going to make the interaction different. You know, when you walk through a door, if it's going away from you, it's easy, you push it away. If the door's coming towards you, you're going to have a different animation in the real world. You're going to pull it towards you, back up properly, and go through. And so I have to be able to react. Is the player coming from below? Is the player coming from above? And I've got to do something completely different in both cases. So if the player is coming from below, they're walking up from the door from the bottom, then what I do is I get the location of the player's hitbox on the edge, so the top edge of the player's hitbox with these little this little math right here, the center of the hitbox plus the extent of the hitbox. And then I subtract that from the door's position, which gives me this player relative position y variable, which I've created. So basically, I now have the distance between the player and the center of the door. And I've set it up that that distance between the player and the center of the door is going to be between 1 and 0 when the player is interacting with it. So I'll give you an example. Just because this is all math and theoretical and I want it to be grounded in something. When the player walks up, they interact. At that point, the distance between the center of the door and the player's hitbox is 1. I'm walking through, it's getting closer and closer to 0. Then I step through. The second that door closes, that's telling you the player got to the center of the door, which is really the end of the door animation, and it closes. So that's what this comment is saying. While the door is opening, this number is between 1, closed, or 0, open. And that's what this variable is. Very important variable. It was very hard and finicky to get this just right in a way that will be repeatable for other doors. And then what I'm doing basically is I have a list of images, which is this frames array. So for animators, it's just going through each frame. For that walking animation, frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, frame 4, I showed in a previous video how animations work. I don't want it to go consistently. I don't want it to go based on time, frame 1 at first second, frame 2 at first second plus 0.2. I don't want to be going through these frames based on the time in the game. I want to be going through these frames based on the location of the player, specifically this value, this player relative position. So I needed to make my own animation, which is basically this. I put all of the different images of the door opening into an array, and then I set the image of the door to one of those images based on the player's position. So if the player's position is relatively close to 1, then that door is going to look like it's closed. The closer it gets to 0, we're going to cycle through the frames within that array until we get all the way to 0, in which case the frame is going to be the open door. Really, it sounds more complicated than it really is. If you've understood animations before, it's basically the difference is most animations cycle through the different images in the animation based on time. I'm doing it based on position instead, which gives you this real cool feel of you're actually interacting with a 2D door and it's dynamic when in reality it's still just pictures. Then we have a bunch of code that really goes into closing the door as the player goes through and resetting those variables. Whew, that's a lot. All of that is ultimately just to give us this effect of a door opening and closing. And so at that, it's basically a matter of adding this door frame to the door, and voila, we have a fully functional door. Now there's a lot more that needs to go into this. Obviously the animations for the player needs to be implemented, which I'm not going to go into with this stand-in image right here. And then the fluidity, I feel like it should feel better going through a door. Maybe you slow down in the door, but you don't come to a complete stop as you're opening it. Plenty of things that need to be fine-tuned. But now I have the ultimate, the central components of the door implemented. And so for the next sprint, I'm just going to move on to something and leave this fine-tuning for some time later in the future. So that brings us to the end of another sprint. I only got one thing done this time, but I hope I was able to convince you that it was a really big thing, and I'm really happy of what progress I've made these past 2 weeks. This upcoming sprint's probably going to be a bit shorter since I'm going to be out of town for some of it for Easter, but I have a few things that I plan to work on, such as the inventory system, and hopefully I can get around to fleshing out that art animation that I started on such a while back. Ultimately, thank you so much for watching. Leave a like if you liked the video, and I will see you in the next one.